Chapter 12, we made it to the end of the textbook. This chapter focuses on supply chain management, and it's really an essential part of commerce in general, not just e-commerce, but face to face brick and mortar commerce as well. But certainly, if you can't get your product, doesn't matter how great an e-commerce website you have, if everything's out of stock. So it's an important part of business. Now, we're just going to touch the surface on this. Supply chain management is very complicated, complex, especially on a global basis. And in fact, you can get a 4-year degree at Portland State University on supply chain management. So, what are some of the trends that we see in business to business e-commerce? So, this is not eBay where I'm selling to a consumer. This is where I'm selling my products or services to another company that does something with those, and then ultimately it gets sold to the consumer. There's really been a resurgence in the e-commerce as a way to handle these business to business transactions. And this is primarily being driven by technology. Some of the things in technology is this concept of big data and being able to use AI with our business analytics to better understand what our future needs are for particular resources, products, subcomponents, whatever. So technology is really driving this resurgence in electronically planning for that. And certainly cloud computing has played a big part in it, as well as our mobile devices are so doggone smart now, and that you can accomplish a lot of things just on your cell phone. Artificial intelligence, when it is used correctly, and there are a whole slew of problems with artificial intelligence right now that people are, for the most part, overlooking. I'd say very foolishly assuming that artificial intelligence is fully baked and ready to go and ready to use. There are a number of problems with AI right now, but businesses are using it. You just need to understand the limitations and the potential errors in the current iteration of AI before you make significant business decisions based strictly on that. One key thing for supply chain in general is this whole idea of blockchain. And blockchain originally kind of was developed, the whole Bitcoin idea, is where people first heard about blockchains, but it's a really powerful tool for supply chain management. Walmart was one of the first companies to recognize that and to really implement it. And it is one of the reasons that they continue to keep their prices as low as they do, because they're very effectively and efficiently managing their supply chain. And they heavily use blockchain technology for that. We're not going to go into details about blockchain in this course, but you can look, and there are a number of excellent YouTube videos on there to explain how you can use blockchain with supply chains and so forth. And one of the things that's happening, we're seeing in society, is that people are wanting companies that are willing to be accountable and use sustainable methods in their supply chain. People don't want their Nike shoes built in sweatshops by children under deplorable conditions. They don't want products that are made uh, by destroying the rainforest in South America. People are wanting a supply chain that is using accountable and sustainable methods. And so that's an important thing to understand with your company, your products, or your services. Have you looked at your suppliers and are you properly vetting them so that you can have a statement on your website that says that you only sell products that have been produced in these acceptable manners? So it's something to be aware of. And one of the things that society, too, in the COVID aftermath, is society really didn't appreciate supply chain disruptions. Society is expecting us as business owners and producers to have supply chains that are robust, that we can adjust to unforeseen things that happen. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But people don't want a disruption in the supply chain. So we need to have plans in place for that. So it's estimated that by next year and 2026, that e-commerce will grow to about 55% of our total business to business commerce within the US. And so it is a significant portion of how companies are going to do business in the future to get their raw materials, their products and services so that they can make, their ultimate products to the consumer. And the business to business networks are going to be primarily run by private networks. And these can be industry-wide networks where, in order to access the network for these supplies, you have to be a member of an organization, or you have to pay a fee or a subscription service to it. And we're moving away from EDI. And if you're not familiar with the term, EDI was the method that when computers first started to become affordable for businesses to use back in the 1980s, they needed a universal language that one computer could talk to another computer. So a way of transmitting a purchase order. So they came up with the EDI communication protocol that defined how you structured that data that was sent from one business to another. But we're moving away from EDI as a way of communicating that e-commerce transaction. And that's because of all the powerful tools that we have now for developing, websites that allow for transactions and for communicating, that the old EDI standard is just, it's going away. But having said that, it is still the workhorse that most companies have been using. Like any change, it takes time. It's going away, but it's still there for the time being. And I like this chart from the publisher, from the author, just showing the growth. And you can see that's almost a straight line. Yeah, except for 2020, there was a dip there that COVID, just caused a big dip. You can see the dip that occurred back in 2009. That was primarily the result, I would say, of the real estate crisis, of the market crash in 2008. But it's a pretty significant upward growth going, year over year. So COVID certainly brought the term supply chains to the public knowledge. I would say prior to COVID, most people had never heard of the term supply chain. But what COVID did is it exposed a lot of weaknesses in the current, back then, management practices that companies use with their supply chains. I would say that prior to COVID, most businesses had a very optimistic overly confident viewpoint of things. And so they didn't really put in place systems to what happens when the bottom falls out, you know. And it's it's really too bad because there was a precursor to COVID that should have alerted businesses that they needed to think about this. And it was when there was the earthquake off of Japan, and it knocked out a nuclear power uh, uh, station over there that supplied a bunch of semiconductor chip manufacturing companies that supplied, it was something, I may get the number wrong here, but I would say like 85 or 90% of the world's integrated circuits that were used in automobiles came from that one area. And when the earthquake and subsequent tidal wave hit, it wiped out all the supply chain for automobile. We had vehicles, fully finished here in the US, just waiting for one circuit board because no one could get the chips. It took a long time for that to bounce back. So that should have been a warning signal to the rest of businesses that, we need to look at what our weaknesses in the supply chain are and think about what can we do to beef those up, to shore them up. If something goes wrong, do we have alternate ways of getting that same product or service? And that came about because there'd been too much concentration of suppliers. So there were fewer suppliers, fewer locations, so that when you have a geographic event like that, a weather event, it could be a terrorist event, anything that you knock out the majority of the capacity. That's not a good idea. Now, we do have a lot of tools in the business world that can help us prevent that. ERP systems, when properly implemented in a company, can show management where we have a concentration, where we're getting too much of our raw materials or our subcomponents from a particular company or a particular geographic area. And so we can do the analysis to identify where those are so that we can plan for how can we minimize that. Now, really, when we're talking about supply chains, you hear the term multi-tier supply chain. And what this means is that as a manufacturer, even though I'm selling to the consumer, I don't buy typically just raw materials like raw iron, raw silver. There are mining companies that do that, and they sell to other people that do it. And then there's circuit board companies that make circuit boards, and there's other companies that do injection molding. Unless I'm a really, really large company, I probably don't own all of those. And so I buy something from a supplier who in turn buys components from another supplier, who in turn buys components from another supplier, who in turn buys from someone that actually dug up the dirt to get the iron or the copper, from the ground. And so it's a complex series of transactions. And it can be hundreds or even thousands of suppliers that are involved in the supply chain. And you've got thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of individual part numbers involved in doing that. If I remember correctly, I believe the Ford F-150 pickup has 250,000 individual parts. And so having a complex supply chain with all these different vendors, different parts is, those are the challenges, is how do you manage something that complicated? You know, even, as I mentioned, after COVID-19, we've realized how important it is to understand the supply chain that's in place. So we know where the critical parts are, and we have the opportunity then to put in plans in place on how to deal with that. One of the challenges with a supply chain is demand forecasting. Sales can give us a projection saying, well, we're going to sell this many of this quantity and this many of this model, and we can plan for that. But sales figures are never 100% accurate. They are a best guess. And so even though we've got some demand forecasting, we're saying, well, we think it's going to be this, but we have to have plans in place for how do we adjust quickly if we're off by a little bit or if we're off by a lot. And that's the whole concept around demand forecasting. We're trying to look into the future with a crystal ball that is kind of cloudy. We kind of see where we're going, but we're not sure exactly. But in order to fulfill that demand that we think is going to happen in the future, we have to schedule production. Production does not have unlimited resources. We may have some pieces of equipment that have limited capacity. It may be a labor-intensive product, and so we only have a certain number of workers. We only have space for a certain number of workers. It's not like we can go out and hire a bunch of people, train them, and double the capacity overnight. So production scheduling is also having to look out into that future and second guess that, really like saying, okay, this is what sales says we need to be able to produce. Can we do that? What do we have to have in place for production in order to be able to do that? And of course, the order management, monitoring the orders coming in. The key thing there is monitoring the orders and saying, do the orders match what we were expecting? Are they coming in higher than we expected, coming in lower than we expected? Because we may need to make a mid-course correction. And then the logistics management, certainly that refers to the whole process. We're in a global economy, and it's difficult to find products that are made exclusively locally. You can find a few things that you can maybe say, maybe it's a table that you can say, well, that was sourced with wood that was harvested locally, and it was the wood was produced, cut down to standard pieces at a local mill, and then we went to a finishing. But most products today involve components from all around the world. And so the logistics of getting things shipped around the world through customs and to your facility on the time that you need it, that's a whole big deal. And again, one of the leaders in doing that has been Walmart, and they've been using the blockchain technology to help them better manage their logistics. I was told they have the arrival of their trucks delivering products timed down to the minute when it's going to be at a particular warehouse. And they have done that to minimize the waiting time. So when a truck pulls up, there is an open bay for them to back in, unload it, and off they go. And one of the reasons that they did that was they wanted to minimize the pollution that was caused by having a truck sitting there idling, waiting for the dock, to open up. Any of you who have done any flying, you know how frustrating it is to land at your destination and be sitting out on, the tarmac, waiting for a spot to open up, so that the plane can pull in so you can get off the plane. Anyhow, and this diagram in the book shows a three-tiered system. I would say most supply chains, you're probably 18, 20, 30 tiers in the supply chain, depending on how complex your product is. And each of those particular um, companies that are involved in that supply chain have different lead times. And so, really, the need for using technology to help you do your planning, it's extremely important because it is very complex. So that's the thought I want you to take away from here, is that supply chains are very complex. And as I mentioned earlier, and they're global in nature. You may have parts coming from South America, from Eastern Europe, from Southeast Asia, from China, all around the world to make your particular product. Okay, kind of talked about this already. The firm needs to be able to monitor what's going on of its suppliers, the orders, the transportation of getting it from, where it came into the country to where it needs to be. And we're going to talk just a minute about just-in-time and lean manufacturing. These just-in-time and lean manufacturing are concepts that came about from Japan, um, really as an attempt as to how to put quality into products and to take cost out. So one key thing to do is to take that, analyze your current supply chain situation and see, is there a way to reduce the number of vendors involved in that? Can we come up with a group where we can make this more, we can simplify it. The danger is to oversimplify it so that when you have one supplier that has a problem, just not too long ago, Ford's aluminum supplier had a fire at the factory. And so Ford had to stop producing vehicles because that was their aluminum supplier. They did not have a backup. Now, just-in-time production models, the concept behind just-in-time is this. If I have subcomponents sitting on a shelf, gathering dust, there's several things that does. It takes space. I have to have warehouse space to store the stuff. I also have to pay inventory carrying cost taxes to local and state entities. And there's the danger that that component I have will become obsolete. Engineering makes a change to a new design and I no longer need that component, and I've got 6 months worth of inventory sitting on the shelf. So the idea with just in time was that I don't buy more than what I need. Each day showing up on the loading dock exactly when I need it is the exact number of individual parts. And that sounds like a great idea. However, there are some dangers there. Obviously, you don't have the ability to increase your production because you only have planned for stuff arriving to support your current plan. Now, in order to implement, a supply chain simplification, you may need to work with your suppliers and come up with a project integration in order to do it. And the key to that is the integration of the computer systems, so that if your demand changes, that immediately your suppliers see, wow, the demand just went up. Now, in the past, this has all been you know, handled by people. And a situation happened at the company I worked for. I monitored all my customers' orders coming in. And I knew that my customers had seasonality in their ordering. They didn't order the same amount every month. There were peak months every year where they ordered more. There were months where they slacked off on their ordering. Year after year, it followed the same cyclical pattern. Oftentimes, that has to do with the fiscal calendar that the company works on, or like if you're dealing with, let's say, professional landscapers, they may have heavier use of products in spring and summer than they do in the dead of winter. But I was monitoring my customers' orders coming in, and I noticed that it had a huge spike in the orders across the board. They were just way more than normal. So I got on the phone and I called the purchasing agent and I said, you know, did you have, a major product release that went really well or something? You're just ordering a lot of stuff. And the purchasing agent said, I was just about to call you and tell you to ignore all of that. They had just converted to a new ERP system, and there was a problem with the system, and it was creating orders far in excess of what they needed. Now, as we integrate computer systems together, that can happen more real time, and it can flag people that there's a problem. You need to make a phone call. In my case, it happened just because I was in the habit of going in, logging in, and checking things based on what I knew what I was expecting. Anyhow, and I think that's what tight coupling, really what we're referring to, is that we're getting the delivery of those parts, subcomponents at the specific times when we need it. So again, just in time, the idea is to keep the cost of inventory down to a bare minimum. Now, the other concept is lean production. And what this refers to is looking at the production methods that are used and identifying those areas that really are not adding value. And so it's not dealing just with inventory, it's dealing with how we process things. For example, the company I work for, the normal flow was raw material would come into the warehouse, get put into stock. There were 3 different production lines. The first production line would take the product out of inventory, do the work that they did on it. They would complete their subassembly, put it back to stock. The second assembly line would then pull that subassembly out of inventory, do some additional work on it, and then put it back to stock. And then finally, the third production line would take that second subassembly, finish the work that needed to be done, and then put it to stock as a finished good. And it was changing part numbers at each point, so you could keep a track of, well, I have the first activity done, that's this part number, I have the second activity done, that's this, and so forth. The production manager calculated that from the time the raw products came in, the nuts and bolts, screws, whatever, to the finished good going out the door, that product would travel 1 mile just going from the warehouse to the production floor, back to the warehouse, back to the production floor, back to the warehouse, back to the production floor. And it involved, keying in entries into the computer system each time that this part number, we're putting in, we started with enough to make 100 items, but we only are putting 98 of this first step in, and then we're of that 98, it gets to the second step is only 96, and all this activity that was waste. It was not adding value to it. And so lean production is really looking at everything involved in what we do and focusing on those things that are unnecessary or repetitive duplicate efforts that are not adding value to the end product. So the risk of supply chain simplification, just-in-time, lean production, COVID-19 really showed that we had a lack of inventory because we couldn't get those individual pieces, those subcomponents, because back at the source, they were shut down or they were working with a skeleton crew. They could only produce 10% of what they did before because of the requirements for distancing and with people being sick or whatever. So it resulted in a lack of inventory that prevented them from being able to fulfill the demands. And in many cases, the demands increased because people went crazy. I remember when at the beginning of COVID, I saw a woman with a shopping cart completely stacked and full, a bottled water. Like the person standing next to me, was looking at it saying, COVID, it has nothing to do with bottled water. There's not going to be a shortage, of water. Living here in Oregon, we have very good water to drink right out of the tap. So, but it was people panicked. Toilet paper. You couldn't get toilet paper. Stores had to put limits on how many rolls of toilet paper you could buy each time. So the demand went crazy and there was no way to fulfill that demand because we had the worst case situation. We had reduced capacity. We couldn't produce as much. And the demand increased at the same time. So what this really did is pointed out that we need to have networks of alternative suppliers in multiple locations so that in the case, if we can't get it from one supplier, we can go to another supplier. Okay, Ford can't get their aluminum because the supplier that they were using had a fire at their facility. Well, who's the backup? Who's the alternate supplier? It's good practice to have at least 2, if not 3 suppliers of a particular item that you provide sufficient orders with so that you're a good customer in their standing, so that if you come back and say, is there any way we could increase our orders with you to fulfill it? So you need to have those alternatives and multiple locations around the world so that you don't have a single event, a power outage, an earthquake, knock out all of your suppliers. And we need to build more slack into systems. People went a little crazy with this whole idea of just-in-time and lean production, of trying to squeeze it down to being so precise that if anything goes wrong, then you're stuck. So it's the term I've always heard used is to plan for the unplanned. We shouldn't plan that everything's going to run perfect. We need to plan that there's going to be hiccups along the way, and so that our systems aren't as, pushed to the absolute maximum. And then there's this idea of just in case inventory. This is, just in case we underestimated the customer demand, could we increase production 10% or 5%? Every business, you'll come up with a different number as to what you're planning for, but it's that idea that we should have some safety stock put in place. So just in case, we can respond to this and buy us a little bit of time to ramp up production for this increased demand. So I mentioned earlier before, there's more and more societal push on wanting us to have accountable supply chains. And so people are not happy with some of the labor conditions that have been showcased around the world. Nike has taken a lot of heat for some of the not Nike manufacturing facilities, but the subcontractors that they used in those areas. So it is something that need to be looking at that and making sure that all of our vendors and suppliers are consistent and compatible with society's expectations. And there's a number of organizations that are lobbying for us, as businesses to be using responsible subcontractors. So when we're talking about sustainable supply chains, this refers to our ecological interests. Does this company make reasonable use of water? Do they control air pollution? And the example I'll give is Intel. Intel, in the manufacturing process for integrated circuits, use some of the most toxic and dangerous chemicals in the world. I worked for a while for a supplier that made equipment that Intel used. And so I had to go through all the hazmat safety training on the materials. And like one of the chemicals used by the machine that we provided, a single drop on your skin would kill you in about 10 seconds. But you go out to Intel's location in Hillsboro, and knowing that inside those buildings are these massive, machines that are using all this really dangerous chemicals and everything else. The outside of the facility, it looks like a park. In fact, it looks like a college campus. It's just beautiful and gorgeous because Intel takes very seriously about handling those dangerous chemicals and making sure that none of that spills out into the environment, air pollution, how they use the water. They take it very seriously. And so those are the things that we have to do as companies to make sure that our manufacturing processes, that we are being responsible citizens in maintaining the environment. And I like this point the author makes, that using the most efficient environment, for production, distribution, and logistics is actually good for business. Over the long term, it really benefits us. And as well as it creates values for consumers, investors, and it's just the right thing to do. So it's a smart thing to do to be responsible to the environment. Okay, changing gears. Mobile business to business. Mobile devices have gotten to be so powerful that a lot of businesses, purchasing agents, others, they're involved in using it. We're not using fax machines and telephones to do these transactions anymore for e-commerce. And so when you're thinking about e-commerce, whether it's C2C, B2C, or B2B, you also have to be thinking about, how does my application, my program, my website work on a mobile device? Because people are doing more and more transactions on mobile devices. Another interesting one that the author brings up briefly, it's not really specific to supply chains or what we're talking about, but a number of companies have adopted a bring your own device policy. If you have a particular laptop that you like, saying it's okay to bring it and use that as your device at work, instead of providing employees with a specific device and saying this is what you have to use. The company is using all Windows systems, but you really like your Apple and that's what you're familiar with. So a lot of companies have adopted these policies that will say under what conditions you can use your personal device for business. There's a lot of issues around that with security and making sure the right software and so it doesn't compromise your network, but it's something to be aware of, that is a growing trend. And that came about really, I'd say COVID kick charged that, because all of a sudden we had people having to work remotely that did not have a company issued laptop. They didn't want them dragging the desktop home, and so people were having to use their home computers, and so a number of companies have adopted those policies, something to be aware of. And certainly making sure that whatever supply chain software you use is compatible with a mobile device. Okay, we've talked about blockchain a little bit, the Internet of Things, supply chain management. You have to be concerned about the security, reliability, the cost, and really utilizing blockchain in the supply chain management. That's what's going to replace EDI going forward. So B2B marketing. The interesting thing is that the B2B marketing in an electronic age is more interpersonal than traditional retail marketing. Retail marketing, you have a product and you present it out, with all these features to the broad public. But with B2B, you tend to be focused more on a particular customer and the advantages that your product or services offers for that particular customer. B2B marketing is what my career was involved in. And I spent time knowing what my customers' needs were and where they were having problems. When I would first work with a new customer, the first question I'd ask them is, do you have any difficulties, any challenges right now with the current products that you're using that you would like, solved? And then I would go back to my organization with saying, okay, here, they need something that does this, this, and this. Can we do that? And then be able to go back to them and say, okay, here, I've got a solution for you. So that's a very personal, interpersonal reaction, interactions. And oftentimes when you're doing that, it evolves into selling long-term contracts. When you have a good interpersonal relationship where you have solved problems for the customer, they're willing to say, okay, let's lock in these prices and these volumes, and you negotiate the prices and you come up with an agreement. That's what I would do on an annual basis. I would go and visit all my customers and say, okay, here's your pricing for the coming year, and we would negotiate, and they'd say, well, I've got these volumes going up, and saying, okay, well, I can give you a price reduction there, or I can do this. But it was again, a relationship between us as a supplier and those buyers. The other thing that happens when you have a relationship like this is that you can sell a product at a higher price than your competition if you have something that addresses a need. We had a customer who had a very high failure rate, warranty claims on the product, because it was used in a surgical suite. In order to sterilize the products, you go into typically, into an autoclave machine that is very high temperature and humidity, and it just would break down the products. Well, we had developed a superior product that withstood the sterilization process much better. So the purchasing agent agreed to pay more for our product because of that. And at the end of the year, that purchasing agent got a significant bonus from the company because they had drastically reduced their warranty costs by using our product that costs more. But we were able to position that and sell it to the buyer because we had that personal relationship and because we had demonstrated to them in the past that we could solve problems for them. E-distributors, really, it's just, I think the only point for talking about this is traditional brick and mortar stores. You had physical distributors that would provide products. You may have noticed if you go into Fred Meyer grocery store and you see someone stocking the shelves there, a lot of times that is a distributor, not a Fred Meyer employee. And Fred Meyer is contracted with them and said, we always want the shelves full of this item. And so the distributor comes in, whether it's once a week or whatever, they stock the shelves, they put extra stock, back stock in the back of the store. That whole model is transitioning more and more to a B2B e-commerce type of transaction. Anything interesting here? Again, it's just taking the way we used to do things physically with people, and now we're just making an electronic catalog. Some of the companies that are providing this, you may have heard ads for W.W. Grainger, and you may or may not be aware that Amazon has a business portal for businesses to be able to buy components and sub-assemblies from another business on a B2B model. You may not have seen that before, but they do a lot of transactions that way as well. Okay, supply chain, very important to us as any company. If we don't have the products to sell to the customers, we don't have any revenue. So an extremely important concept for any organization to have a really solid understanding of your supply chain and the vulnerabilities, and most importantly, to have a backup, a disaster recovery plan.